The blizzard had buried half of Caldwell County under 3 feet of snow before Frances Ford even realized she had left her horse tied to a stranger's fence post. It had come out of nowhere, the way the worst things in life always did, a clear sky turning iron gray in the span of 20 minutes, the wind picking up from the north like something angry had been unleashed across the plains, and then the snow falling so thick and fast that Frances could barely see her own gloved hand stretched out in front of her face. She had been riding back from town, a sack of flour and a tin of coffee balanced across her saddle, when the world went white and mean and utterly indifferent to her survival. She was 24 years old, and she had been managing her late father's homestead alone for 14 months. She was not a woman who frightened easily, but the cold that came with that blizzard was something different from the ordinary Kansas winter cold she had learned to respect. It got into her bones like a blade and stayed there, and her fingers had gone from numb to something worse, a burning, useless sensation that made it impossible to grip the reins properly. Her horse, a reliable roan mare named Pepper, had veered east in a panic, and Frances had let her, trusting the animal's instincts over her own frozen judgment. That was how she ended up at Oscar Sutton's fence. She did not know it was Oscar Sutton's fence at the time. She did not know much of anything except that there was a shape in the white, a dark structure, solid and real, and that if she did not get inside something warm in the next few minutes, she was going to become another cautionary story told around firesides in Caldwell County. She dismounted clumsily, her boots punching through the snow crust, and she led Pepper toward what turned out to be a barn door, and she got the horse inside, and then she stood there shaking so hard her teeth clicked together like telegraph keys. She heard the voice before she saw the lamp. "Hey, hey, there's somebody in my barn." The light swung through the dark, and then a man was standing in the barn doorway, tall, wide across the shoulders, wearing a sheepskin coat that looked like it had survived more winters than Frances had been alive. He held the lamp up and squinted at her through the snow-whipped dark, and his expression moved from alarm to something more careful and concerned. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" "No," Frances said, which was not entirely true, but her pride was quicker than her good sense. "Just cold. I lost the road." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Pepper, who was already pressing her nose toward a hay bale with the shameless gratitude of an animal who had made the correct decision. "Come inside," he said. "Your horse will be fine in here. Come inside right now, please, before you fall over." The please caught her off guard. Men in her experience either issued orders or made requests with the lazy expectation of compliance. The please he used was different, genuine, worried, spoken the way someone speaks when they actually mean it. His house was maybe 30 yards from the barn, and those 30 yards nearly finished her. The wind was ferocious. He walked beside her with the lamp and at one point put his hand on her elbow to keep her upright, and she was too cold to be self-conscious about it. Inside, the house was small but well kept. There was a cast iron stove in the corner radiating a heat so intense it made her eyes water. There was a table, 2 chairs, shelves of books along one wall, and on a hook by the door, a collection of ropes and tools arranged with the kind of methodical care that told her this man lived alone and had made his peace with it. "Sit down," he said, "close to the stove. I'm going to get you something." She sat. She pressed her palms toward the stove and felt the blood start moving in her fingers again, which hurt considerably, but was also the best thing she had ever felt. She heard him moving around behind her, heard the sound of a chest being opened. And then he came and put a blanket around her shoulders. It was a heavy wool blanket, the kind that took real time to make, in a pattern of deep burgundy and slate gray, thick and warm and smelling faintly of cedar and wood smoke. It was the most beautiful blanket Frances Ford had ever touched in her life, which was perhaps an odd thing to think in that moment, but cold and relief do strange things to a person's sense of proportion. "Thank you," she said. He crouched down in front of her, level with her face, and looked at her with steady dark eyes. He had a strong jaw darkened by several days of growth, brown hair pushed back from his forehead, and the kind of face that had spent most of its life outdoors weathered around the eyes, good-humored even in concern. "Can you feel your fingers? They hurt. That is good." "Yes," he said, "that is good." He paused. "I'm Oscar Sutton. This is my place." "Francis Ford," she said. "My father's homestead is about 4 miles west of here near the creek." Something flickered in his eyes. "Thomas Ford's place. He passed last year," she said. "It's mine now." "I'm sorry about your father." He said it simply, without the performance of sympathy that some people felt obligated to put on, and she appreciated that more than she could express. He made coffee. Strong, black, hot enough to strip the chill from the inside out. He set a cup in front of her and sat down on the other side of the stove and said nothing while she drank it, which was another thing she appreciated: men who could be quiet without needing to fill silence with themselves. She stayed through the worst of the blizzard. There was no other reasonable option. Oscar spread a bedroll near the stove for her and slept himself on the narrow cot tucked against the far wall, and he was respectful and easy about it, as though the situation were entirely ordinary, which she supposed, on the frontier, it somewhat was. You did not leave people out in blizzards. You took them in. That was how communities survived, even when the community was spread across 40 square miles of Kansas grassland. In the morning, the snow had settled and the wind had dropped, and a pale winter sun was turning everything so blindingly white that Frances had to squint when she stepped out onto the porch. Oscar had already been up for an hour. She had woken to the sound of him chopping wood, steady and rhythmic in the cold, and he had made a breakfast of salt pork and cornbread, which she ate without embarrassment because she was hungry enough to have eaten the cornmeal raw. "I'll ride out with you," he said. "Make sure you get home safe." "You don't have to do that." "I know." He said it with a small smile that did something complicated to the air between them. "But your road markers will be drifted under, and 4 miles in this is longer than it sounds." He was right, and she knew it, and so she said thank you and let him saddle his horse, a big gray called Monument, and they rode out together through the blinding white of the Kansas morning. He got her to her gate and tipped his hat and rode back the way they had come, and she stood at her fence and watched him go for longer than was strictly necessary. Then she went inside and started a fire and realized she still had his blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She had meant to return it that same week. But the snow kept coming, the way it did in that winter of 1878, relentless and punishing, and the roads between their properties were impassable more days than not. Then one of her 2 remaining milk cows got sick, and the repairs on her roof could not wait, and by the time February loosened its grip and the world started showing signs of remembering that spring existed, 5 weeks had passed. 5 weeks in which Frances Ford thought about Oscar Sutton more than she thought about anything else, which annoyed her considerably, because she had a homestead to run and cows to tend and no business at all sitting by her fire in the evenings with a wool blanket pulled over her lap, running her fingers along the pattern of it and wondering about the man who had made it. And he had made it. She had figured that out after the first week. She had looked closely enough at the thing to recognize the deliberate craft in it, the evenness of the weave, the care taken with the border pattern. Men who bought their blankets at the general store did not have blankets like this. This was something made by hand, by someone who had taken time and attention and given both of them into the making. That knowledge did something to her that she could not quite name. By early March, the road west was passable, and the mud was manageable if you were willing to get your horse muddy to the knee, which Frances was. She folded the blanket carefully and tucked it into her saddlebag, told Pepper they were going visiting, and set out east toward Oscar Sutton's property with the sun still low and the meadowlarks beginning to try out their voices in the new thawing grass. She rehearsed what she would say, something practical, something neighborly. She would hand him the blanket and thank him properly and perhaps accept a cup of coffee if it was offered, and then she would ride home and get on with the business of spring planting and not think about dark, steady eyes or the way he had said please in the middle of a blizzard. She had the whole thing very well organized in her mind. What she had not organized was what to do when she arrived at his door and found something she had not expected at all. She knocked. She heard his boots on the floor inside, unhurried and even. The door opened and there he was, less sheepskin coat, more flannel shirt and suspenders, looking as though he had just come in from morning chores. He looked at her with an expression that started as surprise and moved quickly into something that could only be described as pleasure, and he did not do any sort of complicated work to hide it. "Miss Ford," he said. "Mr. Sutton." She held out the blanket. "I came to return this. It kept me alive, more or less, and I'm very grateful for the loan of it." He looked at the blanket she was holding. Then he looked at her. Then he opened the door wider and turned back into the house, and she heard him say something. She caught only the end of it, and then he came back to the door holding something else entirely. Another blanket. He held it out to her with both hands, the same careful way someone might offer a gift they were not sure would be received well. It was different from the first one. This was done in deep blue and a warm amber color, the weave just as tight and even, the border pattern similar but more elaborate, like the first had been practice, and this was the next iteration of the same idea. It was, if anything, even more beautiful. She stared at it. "You made another one," she said. "While the snow was keeping me inside," he said. "I had the wool, I had the time." "You made it for me to keep," she said, not a question she already knew. Well, he had the grace to look slightly uncertain, which was somehow more endearing than confidence would have been. "I made it in your colors, I think, the blue and the amber. I had a notion that those might suit you." Frances looked at the blanket and then at the man holding it and tried very hard to stay inside the practical, neighborly script she had written for herself. It was not equal to the moment. "You thought about what colors would suit me," she said carefully, "over 5 weeks of winter. It gets quiet," he said. "A man's mind goes where it wants." She took the blanket from his hands. Their fingers didn't quite touch, but almost. Almost was its own thing. "Then you'll have to take back the first one," she said, "since you clearly need something to keep you busy." The smile that broke across his face was unguarded and real, and it made her heart behave in a way she was going to have a serious conversation with it about later. "Come in," he said. "I'll make coffee." "I suppose that's fair," Frances said, and she stepped over his threshold and into what was, though neither of them said so, the beginning of everything. The coffee was good, better than her own, she admitted to herself privately, which was a significant concession. He had a knack for it, getting the heat right, not overboiling it to bitterness. She sat at his table with the blue and amber blanket folded over the chair back beside her, and he sat across from her and they talked. Not carefully, the way strangers talk, parsing out safe territory. They talked the way people talk who have been wanting to talk and are relieved to finally have the opportunity. She learned that he had come to Kansas from Tennessee 4 years before, after his family's farm was lost to debt, one of the many casualties of the difficult years that followed the war. He did not talk about the war itself, except to say that he had been too young to serve and old enough to watch the aftermath, which told her more than a longer account would have. He had built his place from the ground up, bought a quarter section with money earned working cattle drives through Texas, the kind of work that aged men past their years and put calluses on calluses. He had decided, after 3 drives, that he was done riding for other men's beef, and he would rather have something that was his own, however modest. She told him about her father, Thomas Ford, who had been a school teacher in Ohio before the war and a homesteader in Kansas after, a man of tremendous stubborn optimism who had believed to his last breath that the prairie would eventually reward persistence. She told Oscar that she thought her father had been right, but that patience was the thing nobody warned you about, how much of it the land required, how it had to be given freely and without guarantee of return. "That sounds like you've made your peace with it," Oscar said. "I'm working on it," Frances said. "There's a difference." He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said. There is. She rode home with the blue and amber blanket across her saddle and a feeling in her chest like the first real day of spring after a winter that has gone on just a little too long. The weeks that followed were made of small things that accumulated into something large. Oscar came by her property one Saturday to help her replace a section of fence that had broken under the snow weight. She had not asked him to, but he had noticed it riding past, he said, and offered. She fed him dinner after, a proper dinner of roasted chicken and boiled potatoes, and they sat at her kitchen table while the sun went down and talked about books, which turned out to be something they had in common. He had brought a volume of poetry by someone she had not read and left it on her table with such casual ease, as if lending books were the most natural thing in the world, that she did not realize until he was gone that he had done it deliberately. She read the whole volume in 2 days and understood why he had left it. The next Sunday she rode to his place with it, and they sat on his porch in the early April warmth and talked about the poems, and then about other things, and then about nothing in particular, just the easy back and forth of two people discovering that the other one's company is genuinely, unexpectedly, wonderful. The town of Millhaven, the nearest settlement of any size, 7 miles south, was a small enough community that nothing went unnoticed. People saw Oscar Sutton riding toward the Ford homestead on a Saturday. People saw Francis Ford's roan mare tied outside Oscar Sutton's fence on a Sunday. The general store, which functioned as the county's unofficial communication center, was alive with quiet commentary. Hetty Marsh, who ran the millinery shop attached to the store, and who was the kind of woman who organized everyone else's business with genuine affection and no malice, said to Francis one afternoon while she was picking up her mail that she was very glad to hear that Oscar Sutton was calling on her. "He's not calling on me," Francis said, which was not quite true exactly. Hetty Marsh smiled the smile of a woman who has seen exactly this conversation before and knows precisely how it ends. "Of course not, dear," she said. Frances rode home with her mail and her flour and a fundamental irritation at the way community life made private things public before they were fully formed. But underneath the irritation was something warmer, something that felt dangerously like happiness. May came in earnest, and with it the real work of the growing season. Frances was planting her kitchen garden and breaking ground on a new row for corn when she heard hoofbeats on her road and looked up to see Oscar coming at an easy lope, holding something in one arm. He pulled Monument up at her fence and held out a bundle of seedlings tomato plants, carefully wrapped in damp cloth. "I had too many," he said. "Mine tend to run long." She stood up straight from her row and pushed her hair back from her face, knowing she had dirt on her hands and probably her forehead and caring not at all. "You started seeds indoors." "Back in March," he said. He was looking at her with that particular expression she had been cataloging over the past weeks, steady and warm, and a little too honest for a man who had otherwise learned to keep his counsel. "Most men don't bother with a kitchen garden," she said. "Most men also burn their coffee," he said, which made her laugh, and the sound of it made Monument shift his weight and flick one ear, startled by the brightness of it. He stayed and helped her set the seedlings in, and then he fixed the catch on her well cover, which had been sticking for months, and she fed him supper and they sat on her porch while the sun went down behind the western ridge in a slow burn of orange and pink that turned the whole sky the color of something on fire. "Frances," he said, "not Miss Ford, Frances." The first time he had used her given name, and he said it carefully, like he was aware of the step. She turned to look at him. "I want to be plain with you," he said, "because I think you're someone who prefers plainness." "I do," she said. "I have thought about you every day since that blizzard," he said. "That is the honest truth of it, and I have been doing my level best not to move too fast or impose on you because you have your own life here, a full life that you built yourself, and I don't have any intention of being a complication in it. But I also can't keep sitting on your porch watching the sunsets and pretending that I'm just being neighborly. That's not honest, and I'd rather be honest with you than comfortable." The sky was still burning behind him. The meadowlarks were trying out their evening songs. Pepper was visible in the small pasture below, moving in slow circles the way she did when she was content. "You are not a complication," Francis said, which was the understatement of the 1878 Kansas spring, and they both knew it. He reached over and found her hand where it rested on the porch railing, and his fingers closed around hers carefully, like he was giving her every opportunity to disagree. And she did not disagree. And they sat there with the sun going down over the prairie and the world going gentle and quiet around them. And Frances Ford felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was the specific peace of a person who is exactly where they are supposed to be. The summer brought work and warmth and the gradual, lovely accumulation of a courtship conducted in full view of the Kansas prairie. They were not secretive about it. There was no reason to be, and Frances had never been a woman who appreciated pretense, but they were unhurried about it too. Oscar came by twice a week in the evenings and sat with her, and she rode to his place on Sunday mornings, and they worked alongside each other when the work called for two sets of hands, which it often did. He taught her a better way to set fence posts that would stay true through the freeze-thaw cycle. She taught him to preserve vegetables in a brine solution her mother had taught her, which he was deeply skeptical of, and then deeply converted to when he opened the first jar in January and found crisp, edible cucumbers. There was a barn dance in Millhaven the first Saturday of June, held in the livery stable with the floor swept clean and lanterns hung all around, and Oscar asked her if she would go with him in a way that made it clear it mattered to him, which made it matter to her. She wore her best dress, a deep green calico that had been her Sunday dress for 3 years, and she let Hetty Marsh's daughter pin up her hair, which she normally wore in a plain braid, into something that felt festive and unfamiliar and right. Oscar picked her up in his wagon and looked at her when she came out of her house with an expression that he seemed briefly unable to contain. "You look beautiful," he said, simply, without hesitation. Frances Ford, who had survived a blizzard alone and was running a homestead by herself, and did not think of herself as someone who required such things, felt the words land somewhere deep and stay there. "Thank you," she said. "You look very fine yourself," which was also true. He had put on a clean white shirt and his good vest and brushed his hat, and the combination of the familiar face and the unfamiliar effort he had made was charming in a way that caught her off guard. The dance was everything a Millhaven barn dance was supposed to be: loud, a little chaotic, lit by swinging lanterns, and fueled by good fiddle playing from old Tom Delaney, who could make that instrument sound like it was having the time of its life. Oscar danced with her twice before the third dance, and he danced the way many large men dance, with more enthusiasm than grace, but genuine and unpretentious about it. And she discovered she liked dancing with a man who wasn't performing for an audience. Hetty Marsh caught Frances's eye across the room during the third song and gave her a look that said "I told you so" without a single word, and Frances gave her a look back that said nothing except that she was happy, which was enough. They drove home under a sky that was absolutely packed with stars, the prairie dark and silver all around them, and Oscar kept the horse to a slow walk that was significantly slower than necessary, which Frances noticed and did not mention. They sat close on the wagon bench, their shoulders touching, and talked about nothing important: the quality of the fiddle playing, whether the Hanson boy had grown a foot since last summer, the fact that the punch had been more potent than advertised. At her gate he helped her down from the wagon and held her hand a beat longer than the task required, and they stood in the road in the dark with the stars very bright overhead and the whole night around them. "I'd like to call on you proper," he said, "if that's agreeable to you." "You've been calling on me for 2 months," she said. "I know," he said, "but I want it to be formal, intentional. I want you to know that's what I'm doing." She looked at him for a moment. The starlight was sufficient to see his face, which was earnest and steady and patient in the way she had come to understand was simply how he was built. "Oscar Sutton," she said, "it is entirely agreeable to me." The summer continued and deepened. July came in hot and golden and made the prairie look like it was made of something precious. The crops grew in Frances's garden, Oscar's tomato seedlings included, with a vigor that she found personally satisfying, and the corn in her field came up straight and thick, and the world seemed for a season to be cooperating. They had their first disagreement in August, which was actually reassuring in a strange way. It was over something practical. Frances wanted to sell her extra wheat to the grain elevator in Millhaven. Oscar thought she could get a better price waiting for the market in Wichita, but getting it to Wichita cost money she wasn't sure she had, and they went back and forth about it with the comfortable ease of two people who were no longer afraid to have a different opinion in front of each other. She did it her way. The Millhaven price. It turned out to be fine, and he did not say anything about it afterward that felt like "told you so," which she noted as further evidence that he was a better man than most. In September, Oscar's younger brother Daniel arrived from Tennessee, 20 years old and full of the nervous energy of someone who has just made a large decision and is not entirely sure about it. He showed up on Oscar's doorstep with a battered trunk and a horse that had seen better years and a good-natured grin that he shared with his brother except in different proportions. Where Oscar wore his warmth quietly, Daniel wore his loudly and without apology. Frances met him that first Sunday. He looked at her, looked at his brother, looked back at her and said with perfect sincerity, "Oh, so this is why your letters got so much shorter." "Daniel," Oscar said, "what? It's a compliment." Daniel looked at Frances. "He used to write me 3 pages. Now it's half a page with a lot of space between the lines." Frances liked him immediately. Daniel had come west to make his own start, the way younger brothers tended to when the older one had already shown it was possible. Oscar helped him file on a claim about 1.5 miles north, and the three of them spent several weekends that fall working on Daniel's dugout before winter came back around. Frances cooked and hauled water and handed tools, and did not let any of them treat her as anything other than an equal member of the construction effort, which Daniel found hilarious and Oscar found quietly wonderful. The fall was crisp and clear and short, the way Kansas falls always were, a brief, jewel-bright season that had the feeling of borrowed time, everything orange and gold and vivid against the wide blue sky. Oscar and Frances rode out into it when they could, taking long Sunday rides along the creek where the cottonwoods had gone yellow, and the water ran low and clear and cold over the flat limestone bed. On one of those rides, late October, with the first real edge of winter back in the air, they stopped to water their horses at a wide place in the creek and stood beside each other watching the water move past, and Oscar said, quietly and without any particular preamble, "I am going to ask you something, Frances, and I want you to know there is no pressure in it, only sincerity." She turned to look at him. "I would like you to marry me," he said. He said it the way he said most things, straight out, no decoration, trusting that the words were enough. "I love you. I have loved you since approximately the 3rd week of that blizzard winter when I figured out that the reason I kept looking at the weather was hoping for a reason to check on you. I want to build something with you. I want your homestead and my homestead to be the same homestead. I want to sit on a porch with you when we're old and watch whatever grandchildren show up." He paused. "That's a ways out, but I want the whole thing." Frances Ford looked at the man beside her, who had made her a blanket in colors he had chosen for her, who had taught her to set a fence post properly, who had been honest with her every single time when dishonesty would have been easier, who had sat quietly beside her in the dark and been comfortable enough in his own skin not to need to fill the silence with anything except his presence. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He looked at her like he had prepared himself for a longer negotiation and was pleasantly wrong. She laughed, which made Pepper throw her head up and Monument stomp one foot. "Oscar," she said, "I rode 4 miles in the mud specifically to return a blanket, 14 times. Nobody does that." "I thought you were being conscientious about returning borrowed property," he said, and his smile was enormous. "I was being conscientious about returning borrowed property," she said, "and also about you." He kissed her there beside the creek, with the cottonwoods going gold overhead and the cold water moving past and the whole enormous Kansas sky spread out above them, and it was everything that moment should have been. They told Daniel first, because he was the nearest family either of them had, and his response was to let out a whoop that startled 3 crows out of a nearby tree, and then to clap Oscar on the shoulder hard enough to be meaningful. Finally, Daniel said, I was starting to think I'd have to say something. You wouldn't have, Oscar said. I absolutely would have, Daniel said cheerfully. He looked at Frances. Welcome to the family, Frances. We are not a large family, but we are enthusiastic. I noticed, she said. They told Hetty Marsh next because that was functionally the same as telling the county, and because Hetty had been right about all of it from the beginning and deserved the satisfaction of knowing it. Hetty Marsh clasped her hands together and looked at Frances with an expression of such genuine delight that Frances felt a fondness for the woman she had not expected. I knew, Hetty said. From the moment you stood right here in this store and told me he was not calling on you, I knew. You did know, Frances admitted. A man who makes a blanket in a woman's colors, Hetty said, shaking her head. That is not a complicated man to read. The wedding was planned for the following April, because winter was coming and a spring wedding seemed right for the prairie, everything coming back, everything starting over. There was no church in Millhaven, but there was the circuit preacher, Reverend Alton Graves, who came through every 6 weeks or so, and was a decent man who kept his sermons short, which Frances respected. In the meantime, there were practical things to work out. The question of which property they would make their primary home was one Frances had thought about. Oscar's place was bigger and the house was better built. Her father's homestead was smaller, but it had the creek access, which was valuable, and she had put 14 months of her own sweat and grief into that land, and she was not prepared to simply abandon it. Oscar, to his considerable credit, did not suggest she should. We keep both, he said. Run them as one operation. I'll move in with you at your place since the creek makes it the better piece, and will use my property for grazing the cattle. You're willing to leave your house, she said. I'm willing to go where you are, he said. The house is just boards. She looked at him with something that was almost exasperation and entirely love. Oscar Sutton, sometimes you make it very difficult to maintain a reasonable attitude. I'll take that as a compliment, he said. The winter of 1878 going into 1879 was, mercifully, less severe than the previous one. There were cold weeks and hard freezes, and one snowstorm in January that kept everyone indoors for 3 days, but nothing like the blizzard that had started everything. Frances sat by her stove on those cold evenings with the blue and amber blanket over her lap and Oscar's ring on her finger. A simple silver band he had brought back from Wichita, not elaborate but exactly right, and felt the strange, specific happiness of someone who has survived the worst a season could offer and come out the other side with something better than they had started with. Oscar came to dinner 3 times a week through the winter, riding the 4 miles each way in the cold without complaint, and on the particularly brutal nights, she made him stay in her father's old room rather than ride back in the dark and the cold, and he always thanked her for it with such genuine straightforwardness that she never once felt awkward about the arrangement. Daniel came along sometimes, because he was alone in his new place and the company was welcome, and he was not the kind of person who could sit still in an empty house without going slightly mad with boredom. He was good company, full of stories from Tennessee, full of opinions about everything, bad at cards and very willing to lose at them, which made him a pleasant opponent. He had a good laugh and an instinct for lightening a room, and Frances found herself genuinely fond of him in a way that was easy and uncomplicated. Daniel was also, it became clear over the winter, quietly homesick. Not for Tennessee exactly, not for the place, but for people. He mentioned his friends there, a girl named Clara Whitmore who had apparently been more than a friend, with a wistfulness he did not entirely succeed in hiding. Did you leave someone behind? Francis asked him one February evening when they were playing cards by the stove and Oscar had briefly stepped outside. Daniel looked at his cards. "It was complicated," he said. "Most worthwhile things are," Francis said. "She might come west," he said. "If things go well enough here, if I have something to offer." "You have a claim and a house," Francis said. "That's not nothing." "It's a dugout," Daniel said with a self-deprecating honesty. "My father's first house was a dugout," Francis said. "That is not a disqualifying thing. It is a starting thing. There is a difference." Daniel looked at her with his brother's eyes, which she was still getting used to the same dark steadiness in a face that expressed it differently. "Oscar is very lucky," he said. "We both are," Francis said, because that was the honest answer. Spring came back, the way it always did, tentative at first, a few warm days, then a cold snap, then the real thing, the steady warming that brought the grass back green and the creeks running high with snowmelt and the birds back in noisy quantities, asserting their territorial claims over the bare branches. The wedding was on the 15th of April, 1879, a Tuesday because Reverend Graves happened to be coming through on a Tuesday, and because Francis had decided that waiting for a Saturday was not worth the extra 4 days. Hetty Marsh and 2 other women from town came out to the Ford homestead to help make it right. There were wildflowers from the creek bottom in a tin can on the table, and someone had pressed Francis's good dress and hung it on the door, and Hetty had brought a proper cake, which was a significant undertaking given what it required. Oscar arrived looking like he had taken extraordinary care with his appearance, which he had, and like he was trying not to show how moved he was, which he was less successful at. He stood in the small cleared space of her father's homestead kitchen beside Reverend Graves and watched her walk across from the doorway, and his face was very open, very unguarded, and it was so clear on it. The love, the gratitude, the straightforward joy of a man who had made a blanket in a woman's colors during a winter blizzard and hoped and waited and gotten luckier than he had quite dared to believe. She looked at him and felt her own throat tighten in a way she had not anticipated, because she was not generally a woman who cried at things. But there was something about the specific combination of this man and this room and the wildflowers in the tin can, and the fact that it had all started with a blizzard that hit her with a force she had not prepared for. The ceremony was short, as Reverend Graves's ceremonies tended to be, and the words were simple, and when it was done they signed the certificate on her kitchen table and Hetty Marsh cried with an enthusiasm that made Daniel Sutton look slightly alarmed. Oscar held her hand through the whole reception, such as it was, a small gathering of neighbors in her kitchen, and kept leaning close to say things quietly just for her. Nothing significant, just small observations about the room, the cake, the fact that old Tom Delaney was trying to teach Reverend Graves a fiddle tune in the corner with no apparent success, and each time he did it she felt the warmth of it. The intimacy of having a person who was specifically hers, and specifically interested in her perspective on the world. That evening, after everyone had gone and Daniel had ridden back to his own place with a cheerful salute from his horse and a grin that said everything, Francis and Oscar stood on the porch of their homestead in the April dusk and watched the first stars come out over the plains, and the world was very quiet and very good. "I thought about you," she said, after a while. "That whole winter after the blizzard. I thought about you more than I thought it was proper to think about a man I had only known for one night. One very dramatic night," he said. "I kept your blanket on my lap by the stove every evening," she said. "I told myself I was being sensible about warmth." He laughed low and warm. "I was weaving the second one by the second week," he said. "Told myself I had extra wool to use up. We were both very good at lying to ourselves," she said. "We were," he said. He looked down at her. "I'm glad the blizzard came." She thought about that. The cold and the fear and the way her fingers had burned as they warmed, and the way the heat of that cast iron stove had felt like grace, and the particular burgundy and slate gray of the blanket he had put around her shoulders, and his voice saying please in the dark. "So am I," she said. The first year of their marriage was built of ordinary things and extraordinary moments woven together in the way that a good life is made. They ran the two properties as one, the way they had planned, Oscar moving his horses and cattle to the Ford land for the creek access, using his own place's additional acreage for summer grazing. They were not wealthy by any standard, but they were making it work, which on the Kansas frontier in 1879 was its own kind of wealth. Frances proved to be a more natural rancher than she had given herself credit for. She had grown up watching her father struggle with farming, and she had inherited both his stubbornness and his willingness to learn. And the practical education of 14 months running a homestead alone had given her a working knowledge of livestock and land that most women of her time and place had not been required to acquire. Oscar respected her knowledge without making a point of it, which was the ideal arrangement, neither deferring to her nor overlooking her, just working alongside her as a genuine partner. They argued sometimes, because two people with their own strong opinions will always find places where those opinions don't agree. They argued about money and timing, and which fence line needed attention first, and whether to sell the brown heifer before or after calving season. The arguments were honest and occasionally loud and always resolved, because they had both made a decision at the beginning that they were going to talk through everything rather than let things go quiet and cold, the way unresolved things do. It was Oscar's suggestion, actually, said during their first real argument in June about the question of buying a second workhorse. "I want us to be the kind of people who say it out loud," he had said, "whatever it is. I grew up watching my parents swallow things until there was nothing left, and I don't want that." Frances had looked at him across the kitchen table with the candor of a woman who was learning to trust. "Then say it," she had said, "and I will." They had bought the horse. In the fall of that first year, Frances discovered she was expecting their first child, a discovery she made with a mixture of joy and practical concern that she thought was probably the appropriate emotional response for a woman who had a homestead to run and a hard Kansas winter on the way. She told Oscar on a September evening while they were sitting on the porch, and his face went through a sequence of emotions in rapid succession: surprise, wonder, something raw and unguarded, and then he looked at her with a tenderness so complete that she had to look away from it for a moment because it was too much to take in all at once. "You are sure?" he said. "I am certain," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "Thank you, Frances." Which was so like him that it made her laugh, which made him laugh, and they sat together on the porch in the September evening with the stars coming out one by one, and the world arranged around them in a configuration that felt, against all odds and all the evidence of how hard the world could be, like exactly the right one. Daniel was delighted. He came over for Sunday dinner the following week, and Frances told him over the biscuits and gravy, and he set down his fork and looked at Oscar with an expression of such pure brotherly triumph that Oscar put his face in his hand. "You have been here a year and a half," Daniel said. "I have been here a year and nothing interesting has happened to me at all." "You are building a fine homestead," Frances said. "It is a very quiet homestead," Daniel said. He looked at Oscar. "Write to Clara." "That is not your business," Oscar said. "It is very much the community's business," Daniel said. "I am the community. Write to Clara." Oscar wrote to Clara. Not because Daniel told him to, but because he had been intending to for 6 months, and Daniel's intervention was convenient cover for the fact that Oscar had concluded, after a year of watching Frances and himself make a life together, that his brother deserved the same chance. Clara Whitmore's response came 3 weeks later, and Daniel read it at their kitchen table with an expression that started cautious and ended hopeful. "She might come," he said. "Then make sure you have something for her to come to," Frances said. "Fix that roof before winter." "I fixed the roof," Daniel said, with the dignity of a man who has been given practical advice and does not love it. "Fix it again," Frances said. Clara Whitmore arrived on the stage in Millhaven in February of 1880, and Daniel was waiting for her at the station with his best hat and a look of barely contained nerves. And what followed was not Frances and Oscar's story to tell, but it ended with a second wedding at Daniel's homestead in May, with the same reverend graves and somewhat better fiddle playing. And Frances thought, watching Daniel's face when Clara said yes to the preacher's questions, that the Sutton family was fortunate in its women. Frances's labor came in the middle of February, which was inconvenient from the perspective of the weather and otherwise perfectly timed. Hetty Marsh came out in the cold and sat with her, and Oscar was present for the parts that a husband of that era could usefully be present for, which mostly meant he chopped wood and heated water, and paced the length of the kitchen approximately 40 miles worth of pacing. The baby was a boy, dark-haired like his father, with Frances's determined chin, and he came into the world loud and certain of his own existence. They named him Thomas Henry Sutton, Thomas for Frances's father, Henry for Oscar's, and Oscar held him that first evening with the practiced care of a man handling something infinitely precious, and looked at Frances over the baby's head with an expression that had no word for it. "Thomas Henry," Oscar said. "Hello," Frances said to the baby, who was unimpressed with the introduction and more interested in the most immediate practical concerns, as newborns are. Oscar sat beside her bed with the baby settled in the crook of his arm and looked at Frances with everything in his face that had been building since that blizzard night, since the second blanket, since the creek and the October air and the silver ring from Wichita, since the April wedding and the first year and all the ordinary extraordinary days between. "Thank you," he said again, the same words as before. "You are going to have to find some new words eventually," Frances said. "Probably not," he said. "These two cover most of what I need." She laughed. Thomas Henry made a sound of mild outrage at being jostled. The spring of 1880 was good. The wheat came in strong, and the cattle had made it through the winter without significant losses, and the creek ran clear, and the tomatoes, Oscar's tomatoes, reliably vigorous, filled the kitchen garden again. Daniel and Clara were settled and working their homestead with the efficient intensity of two people who had waited longer than they wanted to and were not interested in wasting any more time. Clara was a practical woman with a quick mind and a dry humor that Frances appreciated, and the four of them fell into a rhythm of shared labor and shared meals that felt like the beginning of something sustainable. Thomas Henry grew with the steady, cheerful purpose of a child who has been well made and is glad about it. He was crawling by summer and into everything by fall, and Oscar carried him around the property on morning chores with a patience and delight that made Frances love him in new ways she had not anticipated. There was something about watching the man you love be a father that reorganized your whole understanding of who he was. The town of Millhaven grew during those years. A new general store opened, and then a proper school, which Frances was invested in from the beginning, having been a schoolteacher's daughter, and which she helped organize and fundraise for with a persistence that surprised even the people who thought they knew her by then. She served on the school board when it was formed, one of the first two women to do so, which raised some eyebrows, and she raised two eyebrows right back. Oscar was quietly proud of her in this, which she valued more than loud pride would have been. There were hard things, too, because the frontier was not a place that permitted a long run without hard things. A dry summer in 1881 damaged the corn badly, and they had to sell 3 cattle they had not planned to sell, and there was a stretch of months where the money was short enough to be genuinely worrying. They worked through it together, cutting where they could cut and holding where they had to hold, and when the spring of 1882 was better, they met it without resentment of the hard year because resentment is a luxury, and they had not had time for it. There was also the matter of a land dispute with a rancher to the north named Bricker, who had been expanding his operation in ways that paid somewhat loose attention to surveyed boundaries, and who had moved fence line twice on what was unmistakably Sutton land. Oscar handled this with more patience than Francis would have managed, documenting each incident and engaging the county surveyor, and ultimately taking the matter to the county recorder's office, where Bricker's expansions were found to be unauthorized, and he was required to pull his fence back. Francis had been ready to have a considerably more direct conversation with Bricker. Oscar talked her out of it not because he disagreed with her assessment but because the legal route worked and violence on the frontier had a way of starting processes that were hard to stop. "You were right," she said after the county recorder ruled in their favor. "I know," he said with a small smile. "Don't be smug," she said. "I'm not smug," he said. "I'm relieved, and I'm glad you listen to me sometimes." "I listen to you most of the time," she said. "I just don't always agree." "Which is what makes you worth listening to," he said, which was such an Oscar Sutton thing to say that she shook her head and went back to her work feeling the warmth of it all the way through. By 1882, Thomas Henry was 2.5 and conducting himself as though the entire homestead had been established for his personal exploration. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes, and a personality that appeared to be a high-intensity synthesis of both of them, stubborn and warm and deeply interested in everything. He followed Oscar around the yard with miniature seriousness, attempting to assist with tasks that were considerably beyond his current capabilities, and Oscar included him in them anyway, with an endurance and creativity that Francis watched from the kitchen window sometimes, and felt a love for that was almost painful in its completeness. Their second child came in the winter of 1882, a girl this time which they had hoped for, had not assumed, and greeted with a joy that did not know the difference. Clara Whitmore Sutton Daniel and Clara's first, a boy named James, had arrived in June, helped this time with the labor, having the experience now that Hetty Marsh had had before, and the baby came into the world more easily than Thomas Henry had, quick and certain and immediately indignant about it. They named her Margaret Ruth. Margaret for no particular reason except that it suited her from the moment they looked at her, and Ruth because it was Francis's mother's name, and Frances had been thinking about her mother more as she became one herself. She had dark eyes and red-brown hair, and from the beginning a calm, observant quality that was distinctly her own. Thomas Henry regarded her with initial suspicion, and then with the proprietorial affection of an older brother who has decided, upon consideration, that this new development was acceptable. Oscar looked at his daughter for the first time with the same open expression that had greeted Thomas Henry, utterly undefended, washed clean of everything except the specific emotion of the moment. "Two," he said. "Two," Frances confirmed, recovering in her chair with the thoroughness of a woman who has done hard work and is not embarrassed about needing to rest. "The house needs another room," he said. "It will need several more rooms if we keep on," she said, which was not a complaint. He looked at her with the smile that she had been collecting since the first one, that first morning in the barn, something just breaking free and real. "Is that a plan?" "It's an observation," she said. "The plan part is still under discussion." The house did get the additional room that next summer. Oscar and Daniel built it together over 3 weekends, and it was solid and true and had a window that faced east toward the creek, and Thomas Henry immediately claimed it as his own room, which had not been quite the intention but was easily the most efficient solution. The years continued their business. The school in Millhaven became a real institution, staffed by a proper teacher named Miss Eliza Kern, a young woman from Indiana who was earnest and capable, and found the Kansas frontier more interesting than she had expected. Frances served on the school board for 5 years and was instrumental in getting the school a second room and a proper set of textbooks, achievements she was proud of in the particular way that comes from completing something difficult and necessary. Thomas Henry started school when he was 6, in the fall of 1886, and revealed himself to be an excellent student and a somewhat disruptive presence in the classroom because he could not stop talking about things that interested him. His teacher sent a note home describing him as bright and enthusiastic, which Frances translated accurately as brilliant and exhausting, which was entirely consistent with her experience. Margaret Ruth started 2 years later, and her teacher's note described her as quietly remarkable, which was also entirely consistent with what her parents knew of her. Daniel's homestead to the north had grown into a genuine operation by those years, and Daniel himself had grown into the kind of man his brother had always suspected he would be given the right soil, steady, capable, deeply committed to his family. He and Oscar were partners in more practical senses by then, sharing equipment and labor and the occasional fence repair. And the two families wove their lives together in the way that neighboring families do when they like and trust each other. Clara Whitmore Sutton, who had come west from Tennessee on a stage with a trunk and a hope, was by 1886 one of the most respected women in Millhaven, which she had not planned but which fit her well. She had James and then a second son named William, and she ran her household with an efficiency and good humor that made her the first person people came to in a crisis. It was Clara who came to Frances in the hard winter of 1887, when an illness moved through the county and took 3 older residents before the worst of it was past. One of them, old Tom Delaney, who had played the fiddle at so many of their gatherings, and whose absence from the community was felt in ways that were both practical and symbolic. Clara and Frances organized the distribution of food and firewood to affected households with a coordination that their husbands watched with admiration and the wisdom not to interrupt. "You two would have run this county better than anyone elected to the job," Oscar said one evening after a particularly efficient crisis response. "We know," Frances said. "Don't you forget it." He laughed. He never forgot it. There was a moment in the late autumn of 1888, 10 years after the blizzard, that Frances thought about often afterward. She was in the kitchen, early morning, the children still asleep, the house quiet in that specific way that houses are before the day begins. She was making coffee and looking out the window at the October prairie, which was doing its brief jewel-bright performance before winter came back around, and Oscar came in from morning chores with cold air still on him, and a spray of orange grass seeds caught on his coat from the prairie, and he stopped to get coffee and paused beside her at the window for a moment, and without saying anything, he put his arm around her shoulders and they stood there together looking at their land. 10 years of mornings. 10 years of work and weather and arguments and laughter, and the specific accumulated intimacy of a life built together from the ground up. 2 children asleep in the house behind them. Livestock in the barn they had extended twice, fields that had been broken by their own labor, a house that was bigger and warmer and more truly home than it had been the morning Frances Ford had ridden 4 miles in the mud to return a borrowed blanket. She turned and looked at him. He was looking at the prairie, his face comfortable and open in that way she loved, weathered more than it had been by 10 years of Kansas sun and wind, the lines around his eyes deeper, a thread of gray in his brown hair. "Oscar," she said. He looked down at her. She didn't have anything particular to say. She just wanted to look at him, to mark the moment. He seemed to understand the way he generally did. He pressed a kiss to her temple and kept his arm around her, and they went back to looking at their land. Inside the house, Thomas Henry stirred. They could hear his boots hitting the floor, the characteristic crash of a 9-year-old who had never once done anything quietly in his life. Margaret Ruth's softer steps followed. The house was waking up. The day was starting. It was everything Frances Ford had come west hoping to find, though she could not have said so at the time, when what she thought she was doing was surviving a blizzard and returning a blanket. The 2 blankets were folded together in the cedar chest in the bedroom now, the first one, the burgundy and gray, and the second one, the blue and amber side by side, soft and warm and still beautiful after 10 years of use, which spoke to something about the care that had gone into making them. She had kept both. Of course she had. The decades settled themselves on the Sutton homestead with the reliable weight of time. Thomas Henry grew into the kind of young man who makes his parents look at each other with quiet astonishment, not because he exceeded their expectations, but because somehow the small, serious boy who had followed Oscar around the yard had become a tall, good-humored young man of 17 who could fix a fence line, read Latin, and talk about agricultural irrigation with equal facility, and the combination was surprising in the best possible way. Margaret Ruth grew quieter and sharper. She had her mother's gray eyes and her father's steadiness, and a native intelligence that she applied with the unsettling precision of someone who had always been the youngest in the room, but had decided early to pay close attention. She read everything she could get her hands on, borrowed every book from every neighbor within riding distance, and had opinions about all of it that she expressed with a clarity that left adults blinking. Oscar watched his daughter move through the world with a particular pride that he did not know how to fully articulate except in the small ways, making sure the bookshelf was always supplied, taking her on riding trips to Wichita when there was reason to go, making sure she knew that she was as capable and as significant as any person in any room. Frances watched him do this and loved him for it in a specific way that had to do with her own history, and the daughter she was raising, and the world she wanted that daughter to inhabit. Daniel's sons, James and William, had grown up alongside Thomas Henry in the loose, rivalrous, deeply loyal way of boys who live near each other and have known each other their whole lives. James, at 17, had Daniel's laugh and a patience with horses that bordered on remarkable. William, 15, was more like his mother, organized, quick, and intensely practical. The four children together made up a complicated, affectionate, argumentative unit that drove the adults to occasional distraction and more frequent pride. By the early 1890s, Millhaven had become a genuine town. There were 3 businesses on what everyone now called Main Street, though it had not been officially named. There was a proper post office and a doctor who had settled the previous year, which was an enormous relief to a community that had been relying on the nearest physician being 30 miles away in Wichita. The school had expanded to 3 rooms. There was talk of a church, though the congregation was diverse enough in background that the talk had been ongoing for several years without resolution. Frances was still involved with the school, though she had stepped back from the formal board after a decade of service, turning that role over to younger people while maintaining the kind of advisory presence that comes from being the person who has been there longest and remembers what has been tried before. She was known in Millhaven with the specific warmth that communities reserve for people who have done real work for the common good over many years. Not celebrated exactly, just known and trusted and appreciated in the way that is more lasting than celebration. Oscar was known as a fair man and a reliable neighbor, and someone you went to when the county surveyor needed a second opinion, because his eye for the land was uncannily accurate. He had served a year on the county commission and declined reappointment because he preferred the work he could do with his hands to the work done in meeting rooms, and the county commission found this self-knowledge refreshing enough to accept it without argument. They were not wealthy people. They had never been wealthy people. But they had the homestead clear of debt by 1891, a fact that Oscar marked by sitting down at the kitchen table with the final payment receipt and saying nothing for a long moment, and Frances looked at him across the table and understood what the silence contained. "My father never managed it," Oscar said. 40 years and he never got clear." "We did," Frances said. He looked at her. "We did," he said. Thomas Henry left for a 2-year course at the Agricultural College in Manhattan, Kansas, in the fall of 1892, which was a kind of rupture in the domestic order that nobody was entirely prepared for, including Frances, who had been thoroughly prepared for everything. She stood at the gate and watched him ride down the road with his trunk tied to the back of his horse and felt a complicated tenderness that was equal parts pride and the specific ache of watching a person you made and raised become thoroughly, irrevocably their own person. Oscar stood beside her. He put his hand at the small of her back. "He'll be fine," he said. "I know he will," she said. "That's not what I'm thinking about." "I know," he said. "I know what you're thinking about." The house was quieter with Thomas Henry gone. Margaret Ruth, 12 years old and very aware of her increased position of significance in the household, adapted to this with the equanimity of someone who had always suspected she would eventually have her parents' full attention and was prepared to make good use of it. She did. Frances had always taught her daughter that reading was important, that learning was important, that a woman who had control of her own knowledge had something nobody could take from her. Margaret Ruth had absorbed this with an intensity that now expressed itself in a reading pace that went through every book in the house twice and required frequent resupply. She had also, by 12, a firm opinion that she wanted to be a teacher. "Like your grandfather," Frances said. "Like you could have been," Margaret Ruth said, which was a 12-year-old's observation but was not inaccurate. Frances looked at her daughter for a moment. "Yes," she said, "like that." Oscar, overhearing this from the doorway, said nothing and went back to what he was doing, but the expression on his face as he turned away was one Frances happened to catch, and it contained everything. Thomas Henry came home from college in the summer of 1894, and he was the same person and entirely different, which is what 2 years of real education does. He had ideas about crop rotation and soil management that he deployed at the dinner table with tremendous enthusiasm, and they were mostly good ideas, which Oscar acknowledged readily and Frances encouraged him on. He also brought home, that Christmas, news of a young woman named Adela Martinez, daughter of a Mexican family settled in the southern part of the county who had been there since before the county existed. Adela was 20, worked in a dry goods store in town, and had met Thomas Henry at a county fair in September. He described her with an enthusiasm and specificity, the way she argued about everything, the way she was right most of the time, the way she laughed that told Frances everything she needed to know. "Bring her to dinner," Frances said. "You're not going to ask me questions," Thomas Henry said in the tone of someone who had prepared for questions. "I just did," Frances said. "Bring her to dinner." Adela Martinez came to dinner in February of 1895 and was, as Frances had expected, entirely capable of handling a Sutton family dinner table, which was both a compliment to her and a slightly challenging environment. She had quick dark eyes and a quiet confidence that coexisted easily with warmth, and she held her own in the conversation with Thomas Henry and Daniel's son James, who had come with Clara and Daniel, without either shrinking or performing. Frances liked her from the first hour. Oscar liked her from the first 5 minutes. Daniel, who had been watching Thomas Henry's growing interest in this young woman with the partisan enthusiasm of an uncle who finds his nephew's romantic life entertaining, declared before he left that evening that he approved, which Thomas Henry pointed out was not a requirement, which Daniel agreed was correct, but noted that approval was pleasant to have anyway. The engagement was announced in the spring. The wedding was planned for fall, which felt right for a generation that was a decade and a half removed from the blizzard that had started everything, and yet carried all of it forward in the particular way that family stories travel. It was at Thomas Henry's engagement celebration, a simple dinner at the Sutton homestead, the same kitchen table where so much had been settled over the years, that Frances and Oscar sat beside each other in the late evening after the others had gone, in the comfortable quiet that they had learned to inhabit together like a room they had built specifically for themselves. Margaret Ruth, 14 now, had helped clear the table and gone to bed. The house was settled. The lamp burned low on the table between them. 20 years, Oscar said. "Almost," Frances said. "Not until next February, not until the blizzard." "I'm counting from the blanket," he said. She smiled. "Then next March, when I rode 4 miles in the mud to return it." "And found I had already made another one," he said. "And found you had already made another one," she confirmed. They sat with that for a moment. 20 years nearly. 2 children, one of whom was getting married. A homestead that was theirs, free and clear, built from the ground up by their own labor and sustained by their own will. Daniel and Clara north of them, James and young William grown into their own, the community of Millhaven around them, the school they had helped build. "I would like to make you something," Oscar said after a while. She looked at him. "You already made me 2 blankets." "I know," he said. "I was thinking about a third one." Margaret Ruth is getting old enough to want a room that is more entirely her own, and the old blankets are going to stay in the chest. "You want to make her a blanket," Francis said. "I want to make her one in her colors," he said. "The way I made yours. She's been telling me her favorite colors are green and copper. I have the wool." Frances looked at her husband, this man who had opened his door to a half-frozen stranger in a blizzard and put a blanket around her shoulders and made her coffee, and who had never in 20 years stopped finding ways to express the care that was the most fundamental thing about who he was. "You have always had the wool," she said. He smiled. "I have always had the wool," he agreed. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, the same way he had reached across her porch railing that May evening 2 decades past and taken her hand for the first time. "Make her a beautiful one," Francis said. "The best one yet," he said. Margaret Ruth's blanket, when it was finished 6 weeks later, was deep green and copper, and even more elaborate in its pattern than either of the first 2 had been, the border work intricate, the weave so tight, and even it looked like something that should be behind glass in a building in the East. Margaret Ruth received it with the composed delight of a girl who rarely showed how much things moved her, which was a significant emotion for someone of her temperament. She kept it on her bed every winter for the rest of her life. Thomas Henry and Adela married in October of 1895, and the wedding was held on the homestead in the good weather, outdoors, with the prairie spread out around them in the golden light of a fall afternoon. There was a fiddle player, not old Tom Delaney, who had been gone 8 years, but his nephew, who had some of the gift, and there was dancing on the flattened grass, and there was food that the women of Millhaven had contributed with the generosity that marks a community celebrating one of its own. Oscar danced with Frances twice, still enthusiastic if still not graceful, and she danced with him with the ease of someone who had learned to love a man's particular way of doing things, whatever way that was. Daniel grabbed Oscar's arm at one point during the evening, and they stood together by the fence, 2 brothers who had come from Tennessee with nothing but their labor and their willingness to try, looking at the assembled result of 20 years on the Kansas prairie, the house, the land, the children, the people gathered on an October afternoon to celebrate all of it. "Not bad," Daniel said, with the vast understatement of a man who means the opposite. "Not bad at all," Oscar said. Frances, watching them from across the yard, saw Oscar look over at her at that exact moment, the way he sometimes did, as if he were checking, reassuring himself, returning to some source of orientation. She met his eyes from 30 feet away, and something passed between them that was made of everything. The blizzard and the blanket and the coffee and the creek and the dancing and the children and the arguments and the mornings and the whole accumulated weight of a life built together on the open, demanding, occasionally merciful prairie. She nodded at him, just slightly. "The way you acknowledge something that doesn't need words." He nodded back. By 1897, the Sutton homestead had a grandchild in it, Thomas Henry and Adela's first child, a boy they named Oscar Thomas, which caused the elder Oscar to sit down in a kitchen chair as though his knees had forgotten their purpose, an expression on his face that Frances photographed in her memory as one of the images she would carry out of this life. She sat down next to him and took his hand. "You did not expect that," she said. "No," he admitted. "Oscar Thomas Sutton," she said. He looked at her. "He's going to need a good blanket," he said. She laughed, and he joined her. And young Oscar Thomas, 6 days old and held by his grandmother, looked up at both of them with the unfocused, philosophical attention of someone new to the world and already finding it interesting. Margaret Ruth was accepted to the normal school, the teacher training institution, in Emporia in the fall of 1898, which Frances received with a pride that was almost physical in its intensity. She had done everything that could be done from a homestead in Caldwell County, Kansas, to ensure her daughter had access to education and the opportunity to use it, and here was the proof that it had worked, in the form of an acceptance letter on the kitchen table. Oscar read the letter twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it back in front of his daughter and said, "I knew when you were 12. You told me I could be whatever I wanted," Margaret Ruth said. She was 16, self-possessed, and still slightly unused to receiving direct praise from her father without finding a way to deflect it. "I knew that too," he said, "but I specifically knew about this." Margaret Ruth left for Emporia 2 years later in the fall of 1900, and Frances stood at the gate again, the same gate, the same distance, the same ache that was entirely compatible with pride, and watched another one of her people become irreversibly their own. Oscar put his hand at the small of her back, the same as before. "She'll be magnificent," Frances said. "She is already magnificent," Oscar said. "Yes," Frances said, "she is." The new century came in with the particular energy that new centuries always carry, even on the Kansas prairie, even for people who had been doing the same essential work for 20 years and would continue doing it. There was something about the turning of a century that made people look backward and forward at once, measuring the distance traveled against the distance still to go. Frances sat on her porch on the first morning of 1900. Their porch, the one they had added to the east side of the house in 1888, the one with the good view of the creek bottom, and thought about a February night in 1878, when she had followed a roan mare through a blizzard to a stranger's barn, and everything had started. Oscar came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside her and handed her one and looked at the creek bottom with her, and the morning was cold but bright, the grass winter pale and the creek running under a thin glaze of ice, and the sky very clear and very blue above the brown-gold line of the hills. "What are you thinking about?" he said. "The blizzard," she said. He smiled. "I think about that sometimes." "The blanket," she said. "The way it felt when you put it around my shoulders. I had never been so cold in my life, and then I was not so cold, and it smelled like cedar." "Cedar chest," he said. "I kept it in the cedar chest with everything else important." She turned to look at him. The years were on his face, deeper lines, more gray in the brown hair, the weathering of 20 years of Kansas sun and wind, and none of it subtracted from him. It was all addition, all accumulation. "You kept a blanket in a chest of important things," she said. "It was a good blanket," he said. "Oscar, Frances." She shook her head, smiling. "You are the most stubborn, practical, romantic man I have ever known." "I am the only man you have known in that particular combination," he said. "That's why I married you," she said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into his shoulder, and they sat on their porch on the first morning of a new century, and drank their coffee and watched the light come across the prairie. And the world was very quiet and very right, and everything that had needed resolving had been resolved, everything that had needed building had been built. And the people they loved were accounted for. Thomas Henry and Adela in their own house on the south end of the property, with little Oscar Thomas and another baby arriving in the spring. Margaret Ruth in Emporia becoming a teacher. Daniel and Clara north of them, with James now farming his own claim and William newly married. And all of it anchored here in this porch in this morning, in the 22 years of a love that had started with a blizzard and a blanket and a man who had seen a woman's colors in the dark of a long winter and made something beautiful out of it before he even knew why. The blankets were still in the cedar chest, the burgundy and gray, the blue and amber. Both of them together, the way they had been since the day Frances brought back the first one and found the second one waiting in its place. On cold evenings she still sometimes took out the blue and amber one and spread it over her lap by the stove, and Oscar, reading on the other side of the room, would look up and see her with it and smile the small, real smile that had not changed in 22 years. Some things did not need to end. Some things just continued, deepening and warming like a fire well built, like a blanket made with care in a woman's colors, like the word please said in the middle of a blizzard by a man who meant it. Frances Ford Sutton drank her coffee and watched the first light of a new century come across the prairie and felt, in the full and complete and unhurried way of someone who has lived a life rather than merely endured one, everything that was hers. It was considerable. It was everything. It was exactly enough.